Needle drop from pines or evergreen coniferous trees can be quite disturbing for most of us as homeowners, and we're starting to see a pretty sad case of that here at our studio gardens and our woodlands or perennial flowers. Now remember, first of all, though, that pines are evergreens, but even though they're evergreen, they do lose needles at certain times of the year, especially in the fall. It's natural for the pine trees to lose needles, and really it's the needles that are back closest to the branch angles or closer back to the trunk of the tree. That's the older needles, sometimes 2-3 years old, and they drop those each year, but then they'll put new growth out on the end of it. So if that's occurring in the fall, that's really nothing to be alarmed about. What we're talking about, though, are some other problems that could occur. And if you look at the pine tree, sometimes pines will just naturally decline due to site disturbance. Maybe it's a established pine in a new construction area, whether it's maybe a shopping strip or individual homes, and just a construction damage can cause pines to drop the leaves or actually lose branches and eventually die a slow death. But with us, we're more concerned with some disease problems. And the ones that we have, actually there are two kinds pretty predominant in the state of Oklahoma. And this particular one is called Diplodia needle blight. And what's happening is when you look at each individual needles, you can see that you'll get a band on them, and then it actually dies from that point on out to the tip of the needle. And once you get enough needles with that coloring or discoloring on it, it can actually look like the tree is scorched from heat, and it's very distracting, but it's actually a fungus disease. Also, you'll get some of the ends of the pine tree starting to die back and a little bit of spotting discoloration on the needles, and those will actually spread and can kill out the branches, and eventually you can lose the whole tree from that one too. But it's a little bit more prevalent in the branches and the twigs than just on the needles like the Diplodia. And this one is called Diplodia. Again, it really is very harmful on the branches. Now both of those need preventive sprays to control them, because once these needles have turned a different color, they're not going to really heal up until those needles drop off, and basically you'll have discoloration until after 2 or 3 years till they start to drop. So what you want to do is, on this new candle growth, is actually prevent the disease from spreading on these needles to the new growth on the candles, and that means you need to start spraying around the early to mid part of April to put on a protective spray to keep the disease from attacking those new needles. And the sprays that you would use that are labeled for pine trees are Bordeaux mix, copper fungicide, tin cop, and claries. And again, those are preventative fungicides. You also have to put on more than one application, usually starting in April, every 10 to 14 days, maybe up through June, depending on how wet or how much humidity or moisture we have in the springtime. Sometimes you can cut off that June application. So again, it's a preventative type of thing, but there's also more to it. You need to try to prevent it from spreading more and reinfecting, so you want to cut out the dead branches as they start to die. And then when the needles do fall in the fall, you need to rake those up and compost them or put them in another flower bed away from the pine trees, because if the needles stay on the ground, moisture and the wind can cause it to reinfect the tree. So sanitation is very, very important. Now there are some pine trees that are a little bit more tolerant to these needle blights, and jet black and the white pine are a little bit more tolerant. Loblolly would kind of be next, but Austrian is absolutely the worst one to get the problems, and Scotch can also get it. So really choosing the varieties can also help you out in some of the disease problems. Now the next thing that could happen with pines in Oklahoma would be Pinewood Nematode. And this is really more, it's actually been described by some people saying it just happens overnight. The entire tree dehydrates and turns brown overnight. Of course, it's a little bit longer period than that. Where these takes years upon years for it to really affect it, the Pinewood Nematode is a pretty quick thing. And what happens, the nematode gets in the wood of the tree, clogs up the vascular system so the moisture and the nutrients can't move through it, and it does plug up the tree, and eventually it will die and dehydrate. And the only control there is trying to really keep the beetles from feeding on the pines, and that's hard to do. And once it gets affected, there's no preventative. You have to cut the tree down, burn it, or haul it off, because it can reinfect us from having the nematodes in the wood and being carried from tree to tree by the pinewood beetle. And stress is a very important thing. So any of the trees, if they get stressed from cold temperatures or fertilizer stress or whether it's a pH imbalance, which we've got to check in ours because they have an overall yellowish cast, or drought during the summer can trigger the trees to be stressed, and the nematodes and other problems come in secondary. So always try to keep the trees healthy. At the same time, pine trees don't like over fertilization. So check your soil pH and make sure that the trees are healthy or there's adequate nutrients. Otherwise, you may need to fertilize maybe once a year. So it's real important that you keep an eye on the trees, because there's some things that you can actually do just sanitation wise. And of course, spraying trees this big is really difficult, as windy as it is. But if you're not quite sure what you have, you can look for fact sheet 7618 at your county extension office, and this one talks about the disease problems, the needle cast and needle blight that we talked about. And again, it's something to really take to heart and scope out and try to know what management practice, and again, your county extension office can help you out with those types of questions.